Hello, I'm Frank Epstein, founder and president of Collage New Music. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our latest online presentation entitled The Composer Speaks. The Composer Speaks is an opportunity to introduce composers directly to you. Our guest today is Richard Festinger, born in Newton, Mass., and the recipient of a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Founder of the contemporary group Earplay, a well-respected new music chamber ensemble based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Richard, in his younger years, was a jazz musician, a guitar player, who lists among his credits touring with famed folk singer Joan Baez. A former student of composer Andrew Imbrie, a composer whose music Collage has performed on many occasions. And since discovering Richard Festinger's music some years ago, we are pleased to have performed several of his compositions as well. Formerly on the faculty of his alma mater, he recently retired from the University of California at Berkeley, where he taught composition in order to spend his full time composing. I'm pleased to introduce Collage music director David Hoose, who will lead our discussion with composer Richard Festinger. We thank you all for joining us, and we hope this experience will bring you closer to new music and the composers who write it.
I would be remiss, of course, if I didn't begin by asking you what life is like in California for you right now, both personally, in terms of shutdowns and restrictions that are necessary, and then after that, what it's like for you as a composer trying to keep doing what you love doing.
Well, right now in California, as you've probably read, has been in the middle of a surge, post-holidays surge. It's Southern California is much harder hit than Northern California. I'm just across the bay from San Francisco, but we are here in the Bay Area under pretty severe lockdown restrictions. But that doesn't really represent a big change for me. I've been pretty well sequestered at home really since March, when this all first came about. So it does feel a little more uncertain right now, both with the surge and with these new variants of the coronavirus that seem to be more transmissible, and with the slower than expected rollout of the vaccines, things seem a little more fraught at the moment. But my life goes on, and I'm lucky to be in a place where I can go out for daily walks in beautiful areas without fear of mingling too closely with other people.
Of course, for so many people in so many professions, including musicians, particularly performing musicians, the world in certain ways has changed dramatically, if not actually stopped for the moment. But of course, performing depends upon other people. Composing is a fairly solitary activity. So how has this time touched your composing life?
Well, of course, as this began in February and March, you and I were working very closely together, putting the finishing touches on Cantata, and that really occupied my composer activities early in the pandemic. And then I was supposed to write a short string quartet for, like a movement for string quartet for a concert at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music in honor of Andrew Imbree's centenary year, the centenary of his birth. Andy was my teacher, and I know he was well known to you. And of course, that concert, like so many concerts, evaporated, like all concerts, it seems, evaporated into thin air. But I decided to go ahead and write the piece anyway. And I'm now 3 movements into it.
It was supposed to be short.
It was supposed to, yes, well, right, but now it's expanded into my 5th quartet.
It wasn't originally your 5th quartet. It was just a movement for string quartet.
It would have originally been one movement that I would have later expanded into a whole quartet. But I am determined to catch up with Bartók, who wrote 6. So this is number 5.
There is the Beethoven model, of course.
That 6 at a time, or the Haydn model.
Yes, or the Haydn model, exactly.
The Haydn model, right. Well, I think I would need more lifetimes for that. Yeah. I'm afraid.
So, have you heard any of this, the movement for string quartet that you composed around at the beginning of the pandemic, in any fashion at all?
Well, I do sort of audio realizations. Mm-hmm. Of it, but certainly not by performers. No.
You have, I understand, had some performances, or a performance or 2 during this time, maybe solo works or something?
Well, actually, it's interesting. I had this last spring. I had quite a large number of performances that were canceled.
Oh, that were canceled. Okay, I'm sorry to hear that.
Canceled. But I did have a few things. My 4th string quartet, which I don't know if we ever spoke about this piece, but my 4th string quartet was commissioned by a small organization in San Francisco called the Climate Music Project, and is a piece that uses climate data to organize certain aspects of the music. I mean, I can elaborate on
Please
that.
Do.
If
Please do.
Yeah. So this is an organization that believes that it will be easier to reach people concerning the urgency of climate change through music and the arts rather than through dry scientific lectures. And it's a very interesting organization. They have a science team. The chief member of their science team is a scientist at UC Berkeley named by the name of Bill Collins, who was part of the science team that won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. So they had already commissioned one piece which used data like near surface Earth temperature, concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, ocean pH, and these kinds of things. So they asked me to write a piece using human drivers of climate change. So my data sets...
What does that mean?
Well, I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
Those were population growth, carbon emissions, and transformation of land use from natural land to adaptation for human uses. And the piece concerns itself with a period of time from 1880 projected out to 2080, so a period of 200 years, in which 8 or 9 seconds of musical time represent a year. So the piece lasts about a half an hour and tracks in various ways these different data sets without my really relinquishing my ability to invent melodic or harmonic or rhythmic material.
So I'm still baffled.
Yeah, okay.
So I assume this piece gets warmer and warmer as it goes.
Yeah, indeed.
Bleaker and bleaker, perhaps, unless there is an optimistic, turn at some point. But
yes.
But how is this scientific data translated into musical sounds?
So so that was challenging. I went through about 5 different attempts to figure out how to map this data onto musical dimensions. And what I ended up with was that population growth controls the density of musical events. Mm-hmm. So the piece begins very spaciously. In 1880, there's, I don't know, fewer than 1.5 billion people in the world, I think. And everything's in all these dimensions. Things are pretty stable up until about 1945, when suddenly you get the real exponential growth. Anyway, so population growth controls the density of musical events. So the music becomes more and more dense, which also translates into a greater sense of vitesse, higher, a faster tempo. So the most difficult one really was carbon emissions, because the change in carbon emissions from 1880, where it's about 176 million tons, projected out to 2080 in the worst case scenario, increases by a factor of around 120 or 130. And it's hard to think of a musical dimension that occupies that wide a range of values. So what I settled on, which I still think was the closest one, was frequency range, because musical frequencies go from down around 27 hertz or even a little lower, way up into the 4,000s.
Beyond your and my hearing.
No. I'm talking about, the high end of the, violin playing high harmonics and that sort of thing. So I had to compress things a little bit, but so as the piece begins in the very middle register. It's a string quartet, but if you imagine it played on the piano, it would begin in the middle of the piano, in the space of a perfect fifth centered around middle C. Mm-hmm. And then over the course of the piece, the tessitura expands to the point where at the end of the piece, the cello finally gets down to the low C string, and the violins are playing very, very high harmonics. Mm-hmm. Then the third dimension was transformation of land use, and I used that to control that. That's not such a dramatic change, actually, and I used that to control timbre, to control the number of events that were colored by solpanticello playing or tremolo playing or pizzicato or something other than the ordinary bowing. There was one other data set that I used, which was a measurement of international cooperation. So I compiled a list of international meetings by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Kyoto Accords, these kinds of things. It's easy to find the months and years of these meetings. Mm-hmm. And then in the course of the music, when those moments arrive, there's just a very brief moment of repose on a major third. But disturbingly brief.
Disturbingly.
Brief.
Did you choose the scientific data points?
No, those were provided for me by the science team.
And then they said, figure out some way to translate this.
Yes, and we talked about that. And after I'd written a certain amount of music, we got together. I played for them what I had been working on, and they were very happy. I did want to address. You brought up this question of bleakness and optimism over the course of this piece, and I want to address that because it's very interesting, because the climate music project people did not want a piece that ended on a tragic note or a
cataclysmic,
discouraging or cataclysmic note. What they want is for people, having attended one of their shows, to go and sign up for some kind of activism in the area of climate amelioration. Mm-hmm. And so in the period of time that was projection, right, which was approximately the present out to 2080, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change defines several different possible scenarios. They're called representative pathways. And they do this so that scientists who are working on these problems in different laboratories all over the world can can talk to each other and compare notes and refer to the same sorts of assumptions for these different representative climate pathways. And so the decision was, which I arrived at with the science team and the climate music project people, that in the last third of the piece, which is roughly the present to 2080, the music would alternate between the best path, which is the best path scenario, which is basically we do everything we can starting today to ameliorate the effects of climate change, and the worst case, which is business as usual, where we do absolutely nothing to ameliorate the effects of climate change. And so in that last third of the piece, there's sections which alternate between these two scenarios.
So if this was one movement.
It's one movement that's divided into three parts.
I see. If we were to hear this piece, and I hope we will get to soon, and we didn't know what the origins of the piece were, what the motivation behind the piece was, would it sound different than your other music? Or would it sound very much like your music?
Well, it is very much my music. And I think that you would, and I hope that that listeners would find it satisfying just as a piece of music. That was certainly one of my intentions. I mean, my two intentions were to write a good piece of music and to track the data as closely as possible. So I think you do need some explanation of the different musical parameters. And in fact, there is a video that is designed to play along with the piece, which is, if I can describe it to you, it's a large clock face. This is projected on a screen, right? It's a large clock face, and the round clock face is a map of the world, which is turning, and the hand, there's one hand on the clock which makes one rotation over the course of the entire piece. In the interior of the clock face, on the map of the Earth, are superimposed a lot of little green trees. And over the course of the piece, those trees turn into little red people. As tracking the transformation of land use and the growth of population. And meanwhile, on the sides of the video, you get the numbers, the actual population figures, the carbon emission figures, the transformation of land use figures, and so on. So that's, and it's not, it's designed not to be too obtrusive, not to interfere with the listening experience, but just to give the listener a way of visually tracking their progress through the piece.
Given that this piece, the string quartet, its origins are so different from what your other music has been, or a lot of your other music has been, might you tell us a little bit about how you normally begin to write a piece? I've just asked you to write a piece for Collage New Music, and you got these 6 instruments, and we'd like a piece that's, 15, 20 minutes long, and that's it. That's all I tell you. So now what?
Yeah. Let me just say one thing before I answer that question.
You're stalling.
No, I'm not. But I think it's something I'd like to say, which is that, my music it tends to be quite abstract, I guess one might say, and composers, unless they're working with a text or some kind of dramatic scenario, it's not so often that one has an opportunity to write music that communicates something more articulate. And
more articulate than itself.
than itself, exactly. And this climate music piece did represent that opportunity, which I very much appreciated. And as you know, I mean, I followed the next piece I wrote after that was the cantata, which you were so helpful with, and which also is concerned. Of course, it has a text, but is also concerned with sort of bigger themes that we all are so aware of in our world today. So I just wanted to say that the opportunity to write a piece that is about something is attractive at times. Yeah.
I understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so now the question about how I do what I do.
You've got this project, and you actually have a deadline, which of course, the removal of that deadline in this particular day must have some effect on the rhythm of your creativity.
Well, sure. I mean, there is this law. We mentioned Andrew Imbrie earlier, and Andy always used to say, "Well, the work expands to fill the time allotted to it," right? And I think that's certainly true. I would say that my composing progress over this period of time has been slower than what it ordinarily would be. But I think some of that is attributable to the pandemic and this peculiar situation, and getting up in the morning and having it be. And I often think about this movie Groundhog Day. I don't know if you saw this.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Where every day is the same, and but I think it's also attributable to the fact that I think I've become even more self-critical as I get older, and when I say that, I don't mean to imply that. Well, let me not say what I don't mean to imply, but I guess I find myself more and more in the search of ideas that have something beyond the ordinary to them, and I don't know how to. So often when I'm composing, I feel like I just at sea. I really don't know what I'm doing. I had this conversation with Yehudi Weiner actually, who said something to the effect that every time I sit down to write a piece, I think to myself, who am I fooling that I know anything at all about writing music, right? So this search for material is a interesting and difficult to define process. I mean, it involves all kinds of things. I think it involves, sometimes it involves music theoretic ideas that you find interesting in and of themselves. Sometimes it involves Bernstein was always referred to as somebody who wrote music. I think he referred to his own music as music badly remembered, right? You think of there's some piece lurking in the back of your mind that somehow informs where your ideas go, or sometimes it's a matter of improvisation or trial and error. Often for me, I start out with an idea. I have an idea that I think that should work, and then when I put it down on paper, it doesn't work at all the way I think it should have, and there's then a long process of shaping and sculpting and modifying it until it represents what I had originally thought of. Or it might even transform into something altogether different. Or it might just get thrown away.
Well, how much does get thrown away?
I'd say quite a bit.
Of course, the idea of taking something that's rough-hewn and not... your initial impulse is to think, well, this will work, but you put it down and it's bland and it doesn't have the kind of implication that you thought it might. That's certainly something you can see very clearly in Beethoven's sketches. I mean, you look at the sketches of his Fifth Symphony or the A minor string quartet, and you think, really, this guy is a great composer, and it looks rudimentary, it looks unsophisticated, it's certainly unevolved, and let's sort in a sense like sculpting. He kind of pushes away at this and digs away at that, and suddenly something begins to appear. So sometimes it sounds like sometimes you were taking that material and pushing it and pulling it, and then something materializes, and other times you're just tossing it out the window.
Yeah, if it doesn't respond to a certain amount of kneading and, and coaxing, then yeah, a lot of things get tossed out the window. Yeah.
Are you a regular composer? That doesn't make a bit of sense. Do you sit down every morning at 10:30 and compose for 4.5 hours and have lunch? And I mean, we know Stravinsky was very disciplined and would take his afternoon walk and have a fair amount to drink but composed in quite a disciplined way. I was speaking with Joan Tower, and she treats composing pretty much like a 9-to-5 job. And she does it every day, has a lunch break, and something like that. And that's an exaggeration. But not everybody is like that. And I'm wondering what the rhythm of your composing life is like.
Yeah. I do try to compose every day. But my hours are not necessarily regular. In fact, sometimes I think this changes over time, that sometimes I seem to be happiest if I start right in as soon as I've finished breakfast, and I find the morning hours very productive. Sometimes it's the afternoon hours or maybe the evening hours are more productive. And I'm also aware that I guess I must know myself well enough at this advanced age to say that I'm not a composer who can just compose all day, every day. I need other things, to act as a counterpoise of some kind to composing. For example, one of the things I did during this pandemic, when my partner Lynn was in Cincinnati for a couple of months, I took an online course on the special theory of relativity, and that was a great palate cleanser.
So, of the very large number of courses being taught online of this sort, you chose this one, this topic. How did that happen?
My life as a composer has, I wouldn't say it's been exactly tunnel vision, but I've been very, very focused on writing music for 4 decades or something like that. And I become aware that there are other things going on in the world, some of them extremely interesting and extremely important. And so I do these things occasionally. I don't know, 3-4 years ago, I checked a genetics textbook out of the university library, and tried to learn about genetics. And the motivation for this special relativity course really came about because I decided, that I should try to read Einstein. I mean, here's one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, and And in fact, he wrote a certain amount of material for lay readers. And so I got that book, and I got a book that has the 5 papers he published in 1905 that were so important. And, tried my best to work my way through these things. And he's a wonderful writer,
Yes,
extremely articulate in very precise ways. And then I thought, well, why not take a course in it? That will then should enhance my understanding in ways that I'm not going to get just by reading Einstein.
What were your first musical interests? You remember the first well, of course, your mother was a musician. She was playing the piano. So that just means that you probably don't remember that first time when music struck you.
Oh, well, maybe not precisely, but when I was a young, when my family left Newton, we ended up. My father was an academic, so he was peripatetic for a while until he found a job he really wanted to stay in. But we lived for a time in Minneapolis in a big 3-story house, and I remember very well sitting on the landing of the stairs listening to my mother teach. She always taught in our home when I was growing up. And I remember that experience of listening to her teaching very, very strongly. So as a very young child, I did take a few piano lessons.
From her?
No, not from her, someone she brought in. Then I don't know how do these things come about. My mother, then when we moved eventually to California, to Palo Alto, my father took a job at Stanford. And my mother suddenly decided I should take trumpet lessons. And so
you were not necessarily drawn to the trumpet, but your mother was.
No, I don't know how that decision was made, but
that sounds like me. My mother.
Yeah,
she said, "Oh, I love the French horn. Why don't you play it? It's a very pretty instrument."
Indeed, yeah. So the trumpet, I played that all the way through high school, and then I was about 9 years old, I think, when I took up the guitar. There was a guitar in the house that was strung with telephone wires and impossible to play, but that really became my first musical love, was the guitar. And I played guitar. I started with folk music, although a friend of my mother's taught me using the Carcassi method of classical guitar playing, and I took folk guitar lessons. There was a couple of years when my mother actually found a flamenco teacher in town, and I studied flamenco. And, eventually this became a career for me with the guitar. I really kept that up until I was in my early 30s, I guess.
But along the way, you were playing the piano because you have spent a lot of time as a jazz pianist. Is that right?
No, as a jazz guitarist.
But not a pianist.
Not a pianist, no.
And so you eventually went to Berkeley School in Boston, came back to the East Coast and studied with Herb Pomeroy and Gary Burton.
Mm-hmm, that's right.
And did you imagine at that point that you were really destined for a career as a guitarist?
To the extent that I thought about these things, yes.
Yeah, true. You and I are similar ages, and I think we went to school without thinking about whether there was a profession to be had. Whereas today, they're thinking about it before they even get to college.
Yeah,
Probably
yeah.
wisely, but to some detriment.
Yeah.
So when did you first think, oh, music can be written? Music is written. Well, your mother is teaching piano. When did you think I could write music down?
Oh, I think the first, the first example of my composition dates from when I was 5 or 6.
Do tell.
Now, you know, now don't get excited.
Oh, I am very excited. We expect to hear it on the next concert.
Oh no! Well, that won't take long, and it won't take much rehearsal. It was,
What do you
but yeah,
remember?
that was
What do you remember about it?
well, years later, my mother showed it to me, and it was a lot of there were a lot of whole notes.
They're good.
Yeah, they are good. I don't think it went much beyond whole notes.
And did you do that just without anybody suggesting that there are such a thing as composers?
I think I did do it just totally on my own. I think so. Yeah.
So when you were at Berkeley studying jazz improvisation and guitar and things like that, were you also writing music?
Yes, when I entered the Berklee School of Music, I decided to go into their jazz arranging and composition program,
Uh-huh.
and so I did a lot of writing. I studied guitar also, but I did a lot of writing. Yeah. Yeah,
So-
I would say that's really it's just in a certain sense that's where I really started writing seriously.
So at some point, you decided then to go back to the West Coast to pursue what we would call classical music. That is, you went to study with Andrew Embry, and I'm wondering if you can pinpoint anything that might have opened that world up to you.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think there were a couple of things. When I was at the Berklee School of Music in this jazz arranging and composition program, there were some composers. That was in the early 1970s. There were some composers there, Bill Maloof and John Bavicki. I don't know if you know these. Yeah. And there were a couple of other younger people. There was a conductor there named Jeremias Kachinskas, who I think was also a composer, and I had to, I took courses from these people, and gradually became more and more interested in modern classical music. I was listening to Bartók and Stravinsky and Copland, and had absolutely no idea what they were doing. At
Did
this
you
point
like it?
I did like it, and I think I was always attracted to music that I didn't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And after assiduous study, I had come to a pretty good understanding of jazz, and so this other music really became more captivating to me intellectually, because I didn't understand it. I have no idea how it was organized, how a piece was put together, or any of these things. And there was also my mother, who was a very, very curious woman. I remember when the Juilliard Quartet put out their recording of Elliott Carter's Third Quartet. And we bought the recording and the score, and we sat down and tried to follow the score, which is a very complicated
challenge,
one.
yes.
And yes, a
How old
challenge.
were you then?
Oh, I was in my. How old would I have been? In my late 20s, I suppose, mid 20s. Yeah. I just gradually my interests just shifted over to this other thing, when I did go to graduate school in composition to work with Andy Imbrie. Then that was great. Andy opened so many doors to me, and I don't mean professional doors, but musical doors, and the whole environment of being surrounded by people also interested in this somewhat rarefied music was.
I can't think of anyone who would be more wonderful to study composition with than Imbrie, just based on his music and his personality. But how did you go to study with him? How did that materialize? Why did you pick him out?
I met a guy at a party.
Excellent.
It's a good beginning.
Yes.
I met a guy at a party, a guy named Mortimer Markoff, who was a piano teacher, who I knew of. I didn't know him, but I knew of. Anyway, we got to talking. I was in my mid-20s, and he mentioned to me that he was studying with this guy named Andrew Imbrie, and I asked him if I could see what he had written. And
what
so
Imbrie had written, or
no, what Mort had written.
Okay.
Under Andy's tutelage. Mm-hmm. And so Mort gave me a copy of, I think it was a piano sonata. Must have been a piano. I mean, he was a pianist. I think it was a piano sonata. And I looked at it and was very intrigued by it. And I asked him for Andy's contact information, and I called up Andy, who invited me to his home and spent an afternoon with me. He was very, very generous and looked at the music I brought and was very encouraging. And decided, well, this would be a good person to study with.
What was your music like at that moment? How would you describe it?
Well, I would say that it had not coalesced. I had written a movement for string quartet, which was very, I want to say, avant-garde. It was sort of rather conceptual. Mm-hmm. And I had also written a song for soprano and piano based on a William Carlos Williams poem that was more similar to what I've become. That is, more neither conceptual nor really avant-garde, but having its feet, attempting to plant its feet in this great musical tradition. So I think I was really pretty unformed at that point, but having made myself into a jazz musician, jazz musicians are all composers, mm-hmm. because they always are working out ideas that then will become part of their improvisations. So
what worlds did Andrew Imbrie open up to you? What musical worlds? What did he do when he saw your music and you were actually now studying with him? What kinds of directions did he encourage?
Well, Andy was very interested in compositional technique. He would often talk. I mean, my first, I took a composition seminar with him. So there were, half a dozen students in the seminar, and he often would talk about really small details of voice leading and or implications that a young composer maybe hadn't realized that there were certain implications of connections between things that the composer had written that he wasn't aware of, right? And he was also extremely good with with talking about musical form and how a piece, given we would bring in each week a piece we were working on, and he could look at it and size it up, and given what he saw, could make certain suggestions or note certain possibilities about how a piece might unfold, and not in any kind of you should do this sort of sense, but this might go here. What does this material? What implications does this material have for later material? These, and that of course was fascinating. So much of jazz, for example, is cyclical in form. Right, you have a cycle of 16 bars, 12 bars, 32 bars, whatever it is, that which is a harmonic progression that cycles over and over again while different musicians take solos and improvise over that cycle. Well, this is extremely different from the way that the classical music tradition works, right? Which is not cyclical at all. But really, in a sense, I had come to think that, and I still think very strongly that one of the great possibilities that musical notation permits is the ability to create arbitrarily complex forms. Because everything's written down, the performer is freed from memory.
What, besides your sixth string quartet, is next?
I don't know.
That's great. That's good not to know.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. I'm just trying to think if I've had thoughts about that, but no, not too much. This pandemic has kind of put such a damper on all activity. Over the course of the last 9 months, I really have not directed a lot of energy towards instigating new projects. It's curious, almost always in the past, I've composed knowing that there was a particular performance by particular performers at the end of the road, and now with this string quartet, I don't have that. I don't I'm sure I'll find someone who will perform it when the world returns to normal. But it's a rather different sort of thing.
Well, Jacob Schnitzer, who edits these interesting interviews, is finishing an orchestra piece, and I think, boy, what a statement of optimism. I don't know if he has a performance in mind or one promised, but just committing yourself to writing your string quartet, writing his orchestra piece. Those are optimistic statements, which I hope we can nurture because we need them. Richard, it's been a great, great pleasure to talk with you, and I appreciate all your time and your willingness to follow various paths wherever they might lead.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me too, David. I only wish we saw each other more often in the flesh.
Well, we'll hope that happens soon, and we love your music here, and it's a very important part of Collage's musical life, and we will look forward to performing more of your music as soon as is humanly possible.
Well, I will look forward to that myself very much.
Thank you. Stay well. Stay safe. Best
You
wishes
too,
to
David.
you and Lynn. Collage New Music gave the first Boston performance of Richard Festinger's The Coming of Age in March of 2019 on a program that also presented music by Yue Chang, Eric Moe, and Richard's teacher, Andrew Imbrie. The performance of The Coming of Age featured the marvelous soprano Tony Arnold, who in recent years has become a beloved presence in our concerts. Richard's work, which includes 7 instruments, is in 4 movements, each of which sets a different poem by the poet and novelist Dennis Johnson, who died in 2017. The 4 poems, Upon Waking, The Dry, Dry Land Here, Poem, and The Coming of Age, receive searching and responsive musical settings, and they create a compelling cycle. However, the 3rd movement, Poem, may be the one that can most effectively stand alone. Much of this movement has a rushing and earthy swing, a jazzy character often hinted at in Richard's music. In the final moments, however, with the lines, "Oh, the acceleration with which my heart does proceed, reaching like stars almost but never quite, of light, the speed of light, the speed of light," the music ascends and scatters into the atmosphere.
Loving you is every bit as fun, every bit as fun, as fun as coming over a hill into the sun. Into the sun at 90 miles an hour, 90 miles an hour, darling. When it's done, and you can hear the stars unlocking themselves, unlocking themselves. And you can hear the stars unlocking themselves from the designs of God. The disintegrating orchestra, disintegrating orchestra. Of my black Chevrolet. Just as our voices are going home from us to the plains, and the shapes of ourselves as we impose them on thee, prepare to blend with other afternoons. chance there